Hey guys, so for our first lecture of the quarter, we're going to go as far back in American history as we possibly can. So we're going to be looking at the pre-contact Americas, and we're going to see kind of what happens when their world collides with Europe. So the first thing we need to do is obviously figure out how natives got here because they weren't always in this region. We actually are fairly certain that all of humanity originated kind of in one place, most likely near the Fertile Crescent, around Africa, somewhere around there. So how did people get here? Now this most likely happened around the Ice Age, but it happened during a period that we call prehistory, meaning there weren't written languages, people weren't writing things down. So all we can do is guess. Now we're going to use as much evidence as we possibly can. We're going to use things that have been left behind to try to make an educated guess, but ultimately we're never really going to know. So the first Americans are believed to have been nomadic hunters who migrated here, most likely following food sources, animals who were looking for plants. Now, during the Ice Age, the polar ice caps froze, and it meant that water levels everywhere dropped. And so you're going to have lots of islands popping up. A lot of places that are underwater now are going to be above the water during this time period. And that's really important to the land bridge hypothesis, one that probably has the most weight and the most evidence to support it being true. And so essentially the land bridge hypothesis relies on something right here called the Bering Land Bridge. Right, so the Bering Land Bridge is now the Bering Strait because it's just water now. This was once above the water, and we do have a lot of evidence, a lot of artifacts that are left behind on that Bering Strait floor to indicate that it definitely was above the water and that people were there at some point. So we're pretty sure they just kind of walked over this land bridge. Now, there are other hypotheses as well. I think most likely a little bit of all of these are probably true. Like I said, we have the most evidence for the Bering Land Bridge, for that land bridge hypothesis, but the coastal migration hypothesis, the Solutrean hypothesis, and others are all very possible as well because land used to be a lot closer together. So all of these things would have been closer together, these land masses. But also remember, we have little maybe like islands popping up every so often. And so maybe people from Asia kind of island hopped, went from one island to another and ended up here. Either way, though, regardless of how they got here, there was a substantial amount of time where people in the Americas were completely cut off from and had no contact with people from the Eurasian continent. Now, in order to understand what was going on pre-contact, I want to look at a couple of different cultures. The reason that we're going to do it this way is so that we're not getting super overwhelmed with looking at a bunch of different native groups, but we're also going to do it so we can understand something called continuity. Now, continuity is essentially the idea that change happens over time, and rather than it being a progression, like a linear sort of thing. It's kind of the idea that everything is interconnected. Things impact one another, and so we're going to see that in the influence that all of these cultures have with one another. So these Paleo-Indian cultures are located in North America, and we're not going to concern ourselves too terribly much with exactly when they existed. They all were kind of within the BCE time period, which means before the Common Era, back in the like basically when everything when it's the years were going backwards. You know what I mean? You guys know what that is? But it used to just be BC. Now we call it BCE. So these cultures, they're all located in that time period, but we're more concerned with kind of the context and what was going on rather than with the specifics of exactly when they existed. We just need to understand that they existed around the same time and that they overlapped with each other. And they influenced one another. And that's the huge thing. And that's what we're going to see with continuity, that influence and that interconnectedness. And we're going to see how things change and how they grow. So first, I want to start with the Clovis. Now, the Clovis are very well known for using spearheads. And a lot of the time, these are actually referred to as Clovis points. These spearheads were used to kill big game. Now, I'm not talking like deer or even buffalo. We're talking like Manny from Ice Age, big game, mastodons, huge things like that. And this is kind of happening in the Ice Age. So that tells us some stuff. Now, people made these spearheads, right? They fashioned them usually using rock to make more rock into a big point. And so it tells us that people were working together. Even with this huge spear, one spear is not going to take down Manny from Ice Age, right? So people are working together so that they can feed themselves, so that they can feed maybe families. So we know that they're progressing to living in groups, maybe for protection, things like that. So then we move on to the Folsom, and the Folsom are going to be heavily influenced by the Clovis. Just like the Clovis, they're going to use those spearheads, but their spearheads are going to be a little bit different. They're going to be a little bit smaller, but the big thing that you might notice about them is right here. You see on the inside of the Folsom points, it's grooved, right? There's a little indentation, and that takes additional skill. It means for us, for our purposes, for what we're trying to figure out, because remember, things aren't written down. So we're kind of extrapolating, and so we're starting to understand, because it requires more technical skill to make these, it means that people now have jobs, that they're not just all kind of concerned with hunting and gathering food. So they're probably getting bigger, they're getting a little bit more settled, they're maybe forming into more of a society than just a band of people. But they're still using those spearheads and they're improving upon them. All right, so then we've got the Plano, and the Plano are going to be influenced by the Folsom. So not only are they going to use spearheads, but they're also going to start to use arrowheads. Now, as technology advances, something that we're going to see a lot of the time is technology advances and things tend to get smaller. Like when I was younger, cell phones were giant. They were huge bricks and you couldn't even do very much on them. You had to press the button like 4 times to get the letter you wanted, if you even had any text messages. But now they're tiny, they're a little bit bigger because like we want the big screens, but the computer in them is definitely a lot smaller, right? And it does a whole lot more. As technology progresses, things tend to get smaller, like computers. And I know it's kind of difficult to see arrowheads or spearheads as technology, but that was technology back then. So we're progressing, we're getting something that's smaller. It's also more effective because you can be farther back when you're shooting these arrowheads. So it's, or when you're shooting an arrow, bow and arrow, it's safer. It's smaller. It means that you can kill smaller animals without destroying the meat. We're also going to start to see them being used, though, to kill humans. And even though this is a really sad thing, because killing people is kind of inherently sad, right? It also indicates a progression of sorts because it shows us that now people are living in these societies, and those societies are maybe organized enough to where either we're killing people because we have vendettas against them, or maybe we're killing them because they're breaking the law or something like that. All right, so now I want to go down to South and Latin America for a few minutes. Now, in North America, we are not going to have, before contact, what we call a civilization. Now, there are several hallmarks of the civilization. You have to have a hierarchy. You have to be kind of horticultural, agriculturally based, so that you're not moving around. You can't be nomadic. The big thing, though, is you have to have a written language. And in North America, the natives that lived there didn't. So that's why when you hear Native Americans being called uncivilized, that's kind of the technical reason that they're uncivilized. We're going to talk about some of the connotations and some of the reasons that we have for calling natives uncivilized, but that's technically why they are not considered to be civilizations. Now, in Middle America, though, in Latin America, there were several civilizations, and these guys are also going to do a really good job of illustrating that same point of continuity that we were talking about before. And so once again, each of these groups are kind of overlapping with one another. Most of them exist in similar kind of time periods, but we're going kind of linearly. We're going to start with the first one. We'll end with the last two surviving Mesoamerican civilizations. Now, these weren't the only groups, just like those weren't the only Paleo-Indian groups in North America, but they're the ones that are kind of tied together. So they're the ones that we're going to focus on. So first, I want to talk about the Olmec. The Olmec are really, really interesting. They're the first known civilization in the Americas. And so they had this very structured kind of hierarchy. They started to develop a religion. They started to worship. They also have these Olmec statues, these faces. And so if you look at the picture on the left, that is actually Olmec from Legends of the Hidden Temple. And that's the name that they gave him, but he is actually an Olmec statue. He's not an actual Olmec statue, but he's modeled after these Olmec faces. So the Olmec are the first known, the oldest known civilization in the Americas, and they highly influenced a group called the Mayans. And the Mayans were the ones that most people tend to know. If you know about a Mesoamerican civilization, you know about these guys, because supposedly the world was going to end a few years ago, right? And it was these guys that were said to have predicted it because their calendars ended. Now, in order to be a civilization, you have to have a written language, right? The Olmecs had a very crude language that was basically just a calendar. The Mayans improved upon that. They used what are called hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are essentially pictures instead of words as we think of them. But they use those hieroglyphs and they have a very, very accurate calendar. And that calendar is how they supposedly predicted the end of the world, because this was the most accurate calendar up to that point. And so their calendar stopped in, what was it, 2012, and so we thought since the calendar stopped, that meant that they were predicting the world was going to end. Most likely what happened is the Mayans actually just kind of disappear at some point. We don't really know what happened to them. Maybe it was a drought, maybe it was a famine, we don't know, but they just kind of poof, they're gone, and so most likely that's why their calendar ended, rather than any sort of end of the world prediction. Now, these guys are going to kind of build on religion. They're going to specifically worship this guy called Kukulkan. We're going to talk about him a little bit more in a second. Kukulkan was this big kind of snake-like deity who was said to have created the heavens and the earth. Like I said, we'll talk about him a little bit more in just a second. But another thing that the Mayans really interestingly did is they built these pyramid-like temples. These temples are really cool because we have a tendency to think of pyramids and we think of Egypt, right? Well, pyramids actually kind of cropped up in a lot of early civilizations, and the Mayans had no contact with the ancient Egyptians, so they didn't learn it from them. They didn't learn it from anybody. So some people kind of think that maybe aliens came down and showed us. I think more likely that was just a really easy way to pile up rocks and make sure that they didn't fall down, but it could also be aliens, I guess. But that's just kind of a really cool fact that most of these really early civilizations used pyramids. A lot of the time they were used for worship, or like the Egyptians used them for burial. And a lot of the time these early civilizations, as they started developing systems of writing, they didn't automatically go to having alphabets like we have. Usually they started out with hieroglyphs, with kind of pictures. Now, the Mayans are highly influential for the Toltec and later on, especially the Aztec. Now, the Toltec are a very warlike people. So the Mayans are very, very influential, but they're influential because of a large trade network. That's how a lot of their stuff is going to be passed along. They're going to go trade, and so people will get ideas from them. They'll start picking up their hieroglyphs, they'll start picking up building tips, they'll start kind of worshiping the same sort of deities, right? They'll pass along all that information. The Toltec are going to do the same. They're going to pass along a lot of information, but instead of using trade, they're going to use war. They are going to worship this guy named Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl is the sovereign plumed serpent, and he is very much like our good friend Kukulkan. These guys are essentially the same dude. They are a snake-like deity that kind of has the same sort of origins. Quetzalcoatl is also going to exist, though, in the Aztecs. So this same guy, we might change his name, kind of like the Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks and the Romans had very similar deities that basically just had different names. So we might rename them. It might be Kukulkan for one and Quetzalcoatl for another, but they're basically the same dude. And so Kukulkan is kind of going to be passed down to the Toltec and then later on to the Aztec. And the Aztec, in addition to worshiping Quetzalcoatl and other gods, are going to be known for their practice of human sacrifice, usually to those gods, as well as for conquering most of Mexico. So these guys are going to combine what the Mayans and the Toltec were doing. They're going to have a huge trade network, but they're going to make that trade network through conquering, through war. It's basically knock knock, who's there? It's us, the Aztecs. We're going to sacrifice some of your virgins. And that's kind of what they did. They would come in, and a lot of their human sacrifice was centered around sacrificing people from those conquered territories. And then once they sacrificed people during wartime, they would become part of their empire. Now, this is something to remember, though, because later on, when you conquer people, instead of bringing them into your empire peacefully, they might remember that, and they might not necessarily want to be part of your empire, right? So keep that in mind. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the Inca. Now, the Aztec and the Inca are both going to exist when European contact happens, all right? So these guys are both here chilling, and both of them are going to be toppled by Spanish explorers, but the Inca were possibly the largest civilization in the world in the 16th century. That's obviously going to change pretty quickly, but there were empires everywhere. The Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Inca were probably, to our knowledge, the biggest. Like I said, that's going to change pretty quickly, though, with European contact. So going back to kind of look at all of those elements of continuity that we've talked about to kind of sum all of that stuff up, right? Elements of continuity, we've got writing that started out as crude hieroglyphs, but ends up improving over time. You've got ideas that are spread either through a large trade network, violence, or maybe both. So you've got that change and that growth. And the big thing, though, you've got these gods. Many of the same gods, sometimes by different names, are worshipped in each of these civilizations, like Kukulkan becoming Quetzalcoatl. So let's go back to North America real quick. So we've looked at these civilizations. I just wanted to give you guys an idea by looking at these civilizations, first of that concept of continuity, but also I wanted you to understand that a lot of the time we have this idea that Europeans are somehow superior to Native Americans, that they were coming and bringing civilization. And I want you guys to understand that civilization definitely did exist here. Now, like I said, by definition, there weren't civilizations in North America, but that's kind of purely by definition. I don't think that they were necessarily any less civilized in North America. They just did things differently. They didn't have a system of writing, but they also didn't need it. Now, the natives of North America are vast and varied. You can see from this map in the middle right here, you have tons and tons of different tribes, different kinds of natives. And these are just the super huge major tribes on this map. This isn't anything close to all of the tribes that lived here. They were all different, and I think that's something that's really important for us to understand. These Native American tribes were not all the same. It wasn't just an Indian is an Indian is an Indian. They had their own grudges. They had their own politics. They had their own interactions with one another. And that's going to be something that Europeans are going to be able to take advantage of. The fact that these groups were kind of smaller. They weren't just one big giant empire. They didn't necessarily work together. They weren't one entity. Now, they did a lot of the time have very close similarities. So there were similarities by region, but there were also some that are kind of not universal, but typical. The typical things about these natives were they were semi-sedentary, meaning they didn't necessarily move all the time. They weren't completely nomadic, and a lot of the time they did have permanent settlements or permanent structures, but a lot of the time they did have small nomadic settlements that would go from place to place. And those permanent structures, you had either people staying there all the time and others kind of moving around hunting, or people would move from permanent structure to permanent structure based on like the seasons. Most of them grow the three sisters, maize, squash, and beans. So they do grow things. They weren't just hunting, they did have agriculture. The things that really set them apart, though, from Europeans and that made them very much other in European minds had to do with their hierarchy and their ideas about land ownership. Their hierarchy was matrilineal. Matrilineal means that things are passed down through the mother. Our society is a patriarchal society. And so that's kind of very opposite. Patriarchal is the father, matrilineal is the mother. So this is a very woman-centered society in an era, at least for Europe, where women didn't have very many rights, where they didn't have very much of a voice. So it was something that Europeans really did not have any sort of understanding or respect for. They also had very different concepts of land ownership. That's not to say that they didn't think that the land was theirs, and we're actually going to see an example of how important their land was to them, but they didn't think that individual people owned land. They kind of felt like the land belonged to them collectively. And so as a result, they're going to be a little bit more free with allowing people to live on their land because they just don't see it the same way Europeans did. There's also something that's really, really interesting in Native culture, and it's something that you see a lot throughout the non-Western world. You don't see it as much in Western civilization, in European civilizations and things like that, but you're going to see something called two spirits in Native America. Two spirits are super interesting, you guys. It's the idea that there isn't just a gender binary. We have this construct in Western civilization, and it's this idea that people are either male or female, essentially that gender and sex are the same thing. And so we give these gender roles, what you're supposed to do if you're a woman, what you're supposed to do if you're a man, right? And two spirits fell outside of that gender binary, not necessarily outside of that sex binary, right? Sex has to do with what's in your pants. Gender has to do with some other things entirely. And so two spirits fall outside of that gender binary and either were men who chose to play the gender roles of women, or women who chose to play the gender role of men. And it's super, super interesting because these guys were revered. A lot of the time they were shamans. Two spirits were called two spirits because they had the sex of one and the gender of another, and so it meant that they were spiritually more connected to the gods. And so that's why a lot of the time they were shamans. This is just a really interesting facet, I think, of Native American culture. They're revered in this culture, and it's not necessarily universal. There are a few Native groups that really didn't take kindly to two spirits, but as a general rule, they were really well respected and accepted, and like I said, even revered and placed in positions of power and authority because they were believed to have a better ability to communicate with the gods. So what you're going to do, this slide is a video. This is the Cherokee creation myth. So I want you guys to go back to the PowerPoint and watch this video. And I want you to think about a few things. I want you to think about that concept of land ownership and what land means to the Cherokee and to Native Americans in general. I want you to think about what their creation means for the things that are important to them. I also want you to look for some parallels. There are some very interesting ideas in this creation myth that might look a little bit like things that you have heard in other religions. So watch that video. It is very funny. I enjoy it. I enjoy it a lot. It was made by high schoolers, but it's actually very accurate to the myth. That's why I show it. But make sure that you watch this video. All right, so now that we've watched the Cherokee creation myth, now that we understand a little bit more what land and animals and plants mean to these native groups, I want to go to Europe really quick, because in order to understand why colonization begins, we need to understand what was going on in Europe at the time. So European exploration is going to start in the 1400s. Around 1492, Columbus is going to come, quote unquote, discover the Americas. We'll talk about him in a second. But they start exploring for various reasons, and there are a few things going on that have to do with that. The first is a period called the Renaissance. The Renaissance is a rebirth of education and worldviews, largely related to ancient Greco-Roman learning. So what happened was, this is after a period known as the Dark Ages. Now, during the Dark Ages, that was kind of a period of forgetting. And so it wasn't like all of a sudden one day everybody, like, their memories were wiped out and they forgot everything. But what's going to happen during the Dark Ages is there's some political instability, especially with the Roman Empire. Things start to break apart, and the people who are in charge are pretty much the Roman Catholics. They are this group, this huge church, and they're the guys that are calling the shots. And so the Catholic Church and the Pope are going to kind of start to hoard knowledge. Sermons are going to be held completely in Latin, but people aren't going to be taught the Latin language anymore. Wealth, money, and knowledge, the classics, the ability to read, things like that are going to become things that the nobles possess and not commoners. And so during the Renaissance, people are going to start to take a look at that. They're going to start to try to relearn what was lost. We're going to see lots of inventions like the printing press that help with this. The printing press has so much power, you guys, because people start to be able to read. They start to learn to read, and they start to be able to get their hands on things that they can read. And they start to reject accepting things blindly. They start to reject not questioning. So they start to question things, and one of the big things that they're going to start to question is religion. And so as they start to question religion, we're going to see the Protestant Reformation begin. Now, the Protestant Reformation is going to be begun by this guy named Martin Luther. Martin Luther is not the same guy as Martin Luther King Jr., just to clarify. People start questioning, and they take a closer look at the Catholics. Martin Luther specifically is going to have his 95 Theses that he nails to the church door. And these are just things that he's like, hey, these things seem like things that the Catholic Church shouldn't do. Maybe we should change it. And religion in general has a very difficult time changing, whether it's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, whatever religion you're talking about. They're very, very slow to change. And so instead of just kind of accepting these things, the church is going to label Martin Luther a heretic, and they're going to kick him out of the church. Now, he's questioning things like, for example, the selling of indulgences. So indulgences were really popular during this kind of period, but definitely during these wars called the Crusades. And an indulgence was basically a get out of hell free card. You buy the indulgence, and it forgives whatever sin you want forgiven, because in the Catholic Church you have to go to confession, you confess your sin, and then the priest tells you what you have to do to be forgiven. So instead of having to be forgiven, you just get forgiven with these indulgences. And you can imagine the kind of things that people are going to do if they have a get out of hell free card, right? But who can afford these indulgences? The rich. And so it's going to spawn a lot of corruption and some pretty bad stuff. So that's the kind of stuff that our good friend Martin Luther is going to question, and the Catholic Church is going to just kick him out. And so he is going to take people with him, and the Catholic Church accidentally creates what's called a schism. Basically, the Catholic Church is going to break up with itself. So you're going to have, at the end of that, the Catholics and the Protestants. As a result of the waning church authority, as a result of this breakup, you're going to start to see the emergence of kings and queens trying to centralize and consolidate their own power. So we call that the period of the new monarchs. In addition to these other three things, and largely because of these other three things, the 1400s and the 1500s are going to start the age of exploration. We start to explore because money usually equals power. So explorers start looking for cheaper, more efficient trade routes. That way you can make more money. If you can make more money, then you can give more power to your monarch or to your religion. And so that's how we end up with Columbus discovering, quote unquote, the Americas. Now, obviously, Christopher Columbus did not actually discover anything because the natives were already here. You can't discover something that people already know about. But also, he didn't even discover it for Europe. The Vikings were actually here hundreds of years earlier. We just didn't really take the Vikings seriously. Europeans thought of them as uncivilized, and so we didn't really pay them any attention. Otherwise, we probably would have known what was going on. So the Columbus that you have likely been taught about in your K through 12 education is a little bit different than Columbus, the actual dude. I don't know about you guys, but when I was younger, I was taught that the reason Columbus wanted to sail westward to look for the West Indies is because he believed that the earth was round and everybody else thought the earth was flat. That is simply not the case. Scientists actually knew that the Earth was round, but according to their calculations, the Earth was a lot bigger than Columbus thought it was. Now, as it turns out, the scientists, and not Columbus, were correct. If Columbus hadn't accidentally run into the Americas, his expedition would have run out of food and drinkable water a long time before they ever got to their destination, so he was pretty lucky. So Columbus was looking for an easier way to the east. He wanted to go west to get to the east, basically, but he ends up encountering the Arawak Indians on Hispaniola instead. He's going to end up making 3 separate journeys, all the while believing that he has somehow reached the West Indies. And he is promptly going to start trying to take advantage of these people. He sets up a quota system, cutting off the hands of those who couldn't obtain enough gold. In a letter he wrote, for example, 100 castellados are as easily obtained for a woman as for a farm, and it is very general, and there are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand. So I'll let you kind of make your own assumptions about exactly the kind of human trafficking that was going on during this period. But this is the kind of thing that Columbus was doing, selling people and killing people who couldn't find enough gold in places that a lot of the time enough gold didn't actually exist. Columbus and the Spanish were known for being absolutely brutal, and an absolute ton of people are going to die because of Columbus's voyage and because of his discovery. So once Columbus brings his men over, the Spanish are going to start colonizing, and they start colonizing in search of what we call the 3 G's: gold, God, and glory. So you're trying to get money. You're trying to spread Catholicism, because with the whole rupture between the Catholics and the Protestants, the Catholic Church, their power is kind of waning, and they want to build their power base up again, and glory for your country. So they're going to do this through the use of conquistadors, who are Spanish conquerors. They actually get their start during something in Spain called the Reconquista. It was a series of campaigns by Christian states to recapture land that had been occupied by Muslims in Spain. So Spain had actually only recently been retaken over by the Christians by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, who sent Columbus on his journey. So these conquistadors are sent to the Americas to take over entire villages. Now, once they actually get to the Americas, these conquistadors are going to set up something called the encomienda system. The Spanish crown would grant large pieces of land to the conquistadors or to other Spanish nobles. So you would have these privately owned estates that were essentially entire Indian villages. And so they were used kind of as plantation slaves. Later on, these natives are used in gold and silver mines as well. But this is how the Spanish kind of take over land. They just go in and entirely take over whole villages of natives. They're also going to start taking over and trying to topple the big empires in Mesoamerica. Specifically, Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro are going to take over the Aztec and the Incan empires, respectively. Hernan Cortez goes into the Aztec kind of pretending to be a god, maybe the second coming of Quetzalcoatl. And he's going to use the Aztec citizens who were part of the empire kind of unwillingly because they were taken over by conquering, and help to topple the empire. Both of these guys, though, are successful not just because of Spanish might, but also because of something called the Columbian Exchange. Now, the Columbian Exchange is hugely, hugely important to American history and to what happens to Native Americans. This exchange is a massive interchange of plants, animals, people, ideas, and diseases between the old and new worlds. And it works both ways. The Europeans are going to get more plants and animals and things like that. And so do natives. But the big thing that natives end up getting, in addition to ideas like new religions, is disease. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, what kind of ends up happening is these natives are exposed to diseases from Europe that have never existed in the Americas. And so they're more susceptible to them. They don't have any immunities to these diseases. And so they are going to die off very, very quickly. Just to kind of give you an idea number wise, there were about 500,000 or so Arawaks that Christopher Columbus met on Hispaniola, just on a tiny little island. By the time you get to the 1870s to the 1890s in US history, there are only about 500,000 natives left, period. So that's how the Spanish colonized. The French are going to colonize a little bit differently. They try to settle first in Florida, then they're going to do some fishing in the Atlantic, but ultimately what they're going to determine is that fur trading makes them a lot more profit. So this means that they're going to have relatively few settlers coming over. Now they do have big colonies, especially in places like Quebec. But compared to what the Spanish and later on the English are doing, they're going to have fewer settlers and they're going to need to have good relationships with Native Americans because they're doing lots of trading with them, which creates something called the middle ground. And the middle ground is both symbolic and a physical place of trade and cooperation between the French and the natives. So we've talked about the Spanish, we've talked about the French. Next time we're going to talk about English colonization and the formation of colonial America.